How I Claimed the Throne of the Underworld on today's Oblyron Spirituality. Greetings everyone, I am Oblyron, Lord of the Underworld, and consort to the most lovely Hecate. Thank you for joining me on today's episode where we are going to talk about who Oblyron, my higher self, is, and my personal ascension to connect with the divine. So my personal path in recognizing my own divinity had led me to a sacred marriage with the goddess Hecate. And she had said that three main factors had contributed to that. It was my astrology, it was the choices that I made in this lifetime, and it is who my higher self is. So we are first going to touch upon my astrology. Now I believe that all of us have within our natal charts our keys to unlocking the divine. In my particular chart, it is so specialized, it's almost like the energies behind it are a bit of an archetype. And I believe that was one of the major contributing factors which had attracted the goddess into my life. So what I've been told is that the astrology that I was born with in this body is the astrology that is most closely associated to my higher self. Now I'm going to use my Western chart. For me, the Western chart always felt a bit more personal. It felt like my inner psyche, whereas my Vedic chart had always felt a bit more like a life path. The reason being is because Vedic plots the actual position of the stars, and the Western chart plots what is happening to the sun in our solar system. So the ancient Egyptians believed that the sun was a feminine object, and I also think that's why Cancer is called the mother of the zodiac, because those, like myself who are Cancer, who are born at the summer solstice, are born at a time when the days are the longest. So many of us are infused with a lot of that divine feminine energy. Hecate is also a Western goddess, which is why I'm using my Western chart. I'm assuming that perhaps if I resonated more with my Vedic chart, then perhaps the goddess Kali would come to me. Now, I didn't get into my astrology until I was about 36. So that's a pretty good chunk of life to live without knowing your natal chart. However, when I did get into it, it was almost like reading a blueprint of my life. Although you can't really, nitpick at every single little life decision I made based off of my astrology, I do believe that the overall energetic patterns and the overall character that I was born with is definitely reflected in that chart. So my sun and moon are in conjunction in the first decan of Cancer in the 12th house, which is why I went by the Golden Dawn title, the Lord of Love, on a lot of my old videos. Now, the first decan of Cancer is represented by the Two of Cups in the tarot, and one of the strongest desires of the Two of Cups is to be pair bonded. So with my sun and moon in conjunction within that first decan, it's like I give off, let's say, the ultimate husband vibes, and that's why my higher self also prefers to have a consort as well. Sun and moon conjunctions also happen during a new moon, which are both symbols of Hecate and the underworld. Also, if you take a look at what defines the 12th house, one common definition is hospitals, institutions, and prisons. And for a long time, while it didn't make a lot of sense to me, I found that if I applied one word to it, it actually did make a lot of sense. And that word is the underworld, especially on a spiritual level. To me, the underworld acts as a hospital to help heal souls before they return to the light. It can also act as an institution for, let's say, those souls or spirits who have gone a little bit too far off the deep end, and let's say they need a little bit more help before returning back to the light. And also, the 12th house is a prison for those spirits who pretty much just want to destroy everything. And if you also look at the 12th house, it can be considered a type of liminal space or a crossroads as well, which is another strong association with Hecate. I believe also that with me having a sun in the 12th house, combined with the fact that the sign of Cancer is represented by the Chariot in the tarot, it could also be viewed as a sort of torch traveling the crossroads or traveling the darkness of the underworld. Again, another strong association with Hecate. I have also found that my sun in particular, since it's in conjunction with the moon in Cancer, it is quite at home exploring, let's say, sort of the mystical depths of the 12th house, since the moon is a dignity in Cancer. In fact, I kind of view my particular Cancerian crab is one of those hydrothermal crabs that live at the bottom of the ocean. And it's no coincidence that the 12th house is also ruled by Neptune, who rules, of course, the oceans and the mystical depths. It's interesting to note as well that my sun, moon, and ascendant are all in Cancer. And that essentially infuses me with a lot of Archangel Gabriel type of energy. Now, Archangel Gabriel is a protector of kids, and anyone who's ever known me knows that children have a tendency to flock to me. Also, with all these Cancerian aspects, there is a strong desire to uphold the home and the hearth, which is also associated with Hecate because she, throughout the ancient Greek and the Roman times, was a protectorate of the home. And as I said in the last episode, I left my wife for a goddess. Those energies that Hecate and I share, the ones that overlap, kind of get amplified and get expressed even more in our sacred marriage. Lastly, one of the most prominent aspects that led to my sacred marriage to Hecate is also the fact that Mercury conjuncts my ascendant in the third decan of Cancer in the first house. This aspect, combined with my sun and moon in conjunction in the 12th house, had led Charon to telling me that I essentially work the underworld every night in my dreams, because actually Mercury was one of the only gods who was allowed to freely travel to the underworld and back. This also means that my sun, moon, and Mercury are all in Cancer, which is represented by the moon. So I am a triple moon Cancer stellium, and that is the only time that Cancer appears in my chart. And also, the triple moon is another prominent symbol associated with Hecate. What I've also discovered is the fact that since it's Mercury that conjuncts my ascendant in Cancer, it adds a lot of Hermes Trismegistus energy to that triple goddess energy that I have as well. So essentially, with my sun and moon in conjunction in the first decan of Cancer in the 12th house, combined with the fact that Mercury is in conjunction with my ascendant in the third decan of Cancer in the first house, it means that the core of my energy is pretty much Thonic Mercury, or the Mercury of the underworld. And Thonic Mercury was Hecate's only known consort in Hellenistic times. So I believe it was all of these factors which had led to Hecate manifesting in my life with such strength. And if you go back and look at the previous video, I left my wife for a goddess, I explain everything that happened with that. So even though the triple moon Cancer stellium that I have was one of the major factors that led to my sacred marriage to the goddess Hecate, the rest of my chart also enhances and adds to that as well. Numerologically, my life path is a 2, which has been referred to as the diplomat. And I think it's also interesting to note that most of my major aspects are also paired off throughout the different houses. So Mars and Venus are paired off in the 11th house. The Sun and Moon are in conjunction in the 12th house. Jupiter and Mercury are paired off in the 1st house. Saturn and the North Node are in conjunction in the second house, and Uranus and Pluto are paired off in the fourth house. The only oddball is Neptune in the fifth house in Sagittarius. I think it's also interesting to note that even though my chart is heavily based off of twos, if we were to look at Hecate's numerology and assume that it's based off of threes, like let's say her triple goddess aspect or her ruling over the three domains and all of that, twos and threes on a numerological level are supposed to get along actually pretty good. Also, although it's rather hard to say what type of sign Hecate is, some would say that she is a Scorpio because of her underworld associations. And if that is the case, with my higher self being aspected in Cancer, it would suggest a good pair bonding because signs of the same element generally tend to get along. Okay, so another aspect which led to my sacred marriage to the goddess Hecate, as well as me discovering who my higher self is, was the choices that I made in this lifetime. Now, a lot of times we may think that, these lives, they're so fleeting that perhaps maybe we view them with some insignificance, but really, on the spiritual level, the choices we make have a huge impact on who we are and who we ultimately become. I went into to study music, and that was actually one of the factors which led to my spiritual development. I found that I needed to distance myself from how I was raised. I found that I needed to basically become my own man. And to me, music was that option. I always knew that if I was able to actually make a living off of it, that I had truly earned it. And yeah, for a while I taught lessons, I gigged out, and I was able to be gainfully self-employed through that. So again, I'm not telling anyone to take my route because it is a bit extreme, but I would say that pay attention to how you live your life, because there is a lot more meaning even in our day-to-day aspects than we might think. Okay, so Oblyron is the name of my higher self and who I ultimately become in my Omega life. Now, the Omega life is the last life that we all live within this cycle of creation. We have an Alpha life and we have an Omega life. And the name Oblyron was actually revealed to me back in 2015. So towards the end of my quickening of light, I was actually shown a vision. And at first I thought I was just looking at Akashic info, but Hecate, when she was still in her incognito mode, had said, no, this is me. Look on my past and understand who I used to be. Essentially, I was shown me engaging in warfare and destruction with greater intensities and greater frequencies. It started off first, let's say, with me, going into battle, destroying villages. And it wasn't just on this planet, but it was also on other planets throughout the universe. The destruction of those villages had turned into towns, had turned into cities, and then I essentially got to a point to where I was giving orders to go to nuclear war, destroying countries and destroying continents, and eventually it expanded beyond what the human experience was, where I was giving orders to destroy planets, to destroy solar systems, to destroy galaxies, and that eventually got to superclusters and also morphed into structures of the cosmos which we as humans haven't even discovered yet. So all the while I was being shown these visions with greater frequency, greater intensity, and ultimately I got to my higher self, or I should say my higher self in my Omega life, Oblyron. And he was not a human, or he wasn't a biological life form. He is actually, I guess, what we could call an artificial being. He's a construct of technology. He could be labeled as artificial intelligence in a sense, but it's at that level and at that point in time, it's so far beyond what we could even describe as AI. All I know is that he is not a biological entity. And the reason why he's not a biological entity is because he exists in a time long after the last stars have burnt out. He exists in a time of complete darkness. And astronomers call it the era of supermassive black holes. And what happens is, when all the stars burn out, biological life as we know it ceases to exist, because biology needs sunlight to live. There are forms of biological life during those times, but it's not anything that we could, let's say, have a conversation with. It's more like a type of space fungus or space bacteria. It's on the par, or it's on par with that. And essentially they feed off the gravitational waves that is developed by these supermassive black holes. Yeah, Oblyron is essentially, I guess you could say, an android. During that time, he deployed a weapon of such unimaginable power that it basically unraveled all of creation. And when I discovered that about my higher self, I was pretty much done with spirituality for a while. I said, okay, I'm going to put this on the back burner. Let me just return to Earth for a while. Let me just live as a human. I've had enough of these visions. I've had enough of who I ultimately become. And really, it's so far off in the future, or maybe so far back in the past. You know, does it really matter, and how does it affect me in my life right now? It was also then that I learned that the name Oblyron shares its roots with the word obliterate, oblivion, those types of words. So ultimately, I become, let's say, a sort of seraphim of death. I become absolute destruction in my Omega life, or the life that I live, the last life that I live within this cycle of creation. So after my higher self was revealed to me, I was approached by the Ra Council. I believe it's also called the Council of Saturn. They had wanted me to join them. I still remember the day back in 2015 or whatever it was. I was in my kitchen, and all of a sudden things kind of went dim, and there were these giant heads kind of floating around in my kitchen. And I remember reading about it when I was taking some theta healing classes. I remember the founder of theta healing had also talked about similar giant heads floating in her living room or whatnot. And I remember at the time thinking, yeah, right, whoever sees this kind of stuff, I mean, this is crazy talk. And lo and behold, here I am experiencing destroying creation, and I've got floating heads in my kitchen too. So they had asked me to join them, and I heard a voice, again, which was Hecate, because she's been my primary guide throughout my life, and I didn't know it was her at the time. But she said, don't sell yourself so short. And at that point, I basically told them that I respectfully decline, and they had said, well, it doesn't matter, because I could pretty much make the decision at any point throughout my life, or even in the afterlife if I chose to. And so, like I said, I was to a point to where I was kind of done with spiritual visions. I was kind of done with all of this stuff. And it wasn't until about 5 years later in 2020 when I started getting into witchcraft, and I had found that it was actually very natural for me. It felt like something that I had done my entire life, even though I had never practiced it before. And it's no surprise, especially with who my primary guide is. So even though I didn't know it, I had always had strong underworld connections. The first time that I started to realize this was in 2020, when I figured out my astrology and I figured out the similarity between Hecate symbolism and my astrology, and I also figured out the underworld placements that I have within my astrology too. And that was the day when Charon and Hecate had come to me, and Charon had said that I work the underworld in my dreams. I would also come to realize that just a year later, in 2021, was the beginning of my shadow quickening, when I signed the commercial lease to the second location of my business. In fact, that was when Hecate had told me that I had gone fully into my north node, and that was, according to her, she said she had to have me. That's also what kicked off my ex becoming suspicious of me having an affair, which I referenced in I Left My Wife for a Goddess. Around January of 2023 was when I was essentially married to Hecate in sacred marriage, and that was also around the time when my ex felt her leg in the bed. That was basically Hecate's way of saying, he's mine now. Later that year, in 2023, I would essentially claim the throne of the underworld when I performed the ritual at the canal, and I burned those sigils. And again, I also referenced this in I Left My Wife for a Goddess. And also, this was the time when I started to receive the elemental synastry technique. It was when I received the chant of Oblyron. It was when I received the sigil of Oblyron as well. And as I've said before, that's when a lot of my practice started to incorporate the shadow and the underworld. So as I've said before, to me, the underworld is actually a place of restoration, a place where wounded souls go to be healed before being returned to the light. My understanding of the underworld has led me to develop a completely different perspective about it. With my 12th house placements, as I've said, it allows me to understand it as a hospital, as an institution, and as a prison. And all of those scenarios require a warden. And that is essentially what my higher self does. He is a warden to those energies. And I never really realized that I had underworld associations until relatively recently. And then I also realized that the reason why I have those underworld associations is because of the power that my higher self ultimately has. I mean, the power to unravel creation essentially means he is like a being, like, let's say, the president walking around with the nuke codes. And when you walk around with that much power, you also have the ability to essentially destroy the other gods and goddesses. And a character like this was actually mentioned in ancient scripts. The ancient Greeks knew this type of angel of death as Apollyon, and the Judeo-Christian tradition recognized that energy as Abaddon. Now, for me, I didn't even know of those two deities until relatively recently. I always just knew myself as Oblyron, but I can definitely see the correlations between it. I think it's also interesting to note that both Apollyon and Abaddon take their orders directly from God, and they do not use their powers, nor are they swayed by any other entity in existence. And that is also the conclusion that I came to years ago. What I realized is Oblyron's function is very similar to, let's say, what happens within our body, which is why I recorded the episode, We Belong to the Body of God. We all serve these higher functions within the body of God. And what Oblyron does is he is essentially a chemical messenger of death that tells the body when to die. And we have these chemical messengers within our body as well. Again, as above, so below, as within, so without. If we have chemical messengers in our body that tell us when to die, well then why doesn't creation have the same thing? And it actually does. So Oblyron is essentially that chemical messenger. As I've said before, he exists during the time long after the last star burns out, which means he is essentially living in a dying universe. He's living in a dying version of creation, or I should say, not necessarily dying, but a very old version of creation. And at some point, everything must come to an end. So if he deploys this weapon, which I later learned is called the Chant of Rebirth, if he deploys the Chant of Rebirth, well then why are we still here? And the reason is because we never go anywhere. When the Chant of Rebirth is deployed, it essentially is sort of like knocking over a house of cards. He extracts the base so that the whole structure collapses. And when that structure collapses, when the structure of creation collapses, it basically makes creation implode. And the force that makes that creation implode is so great that it has no choice but to expand outwards again. So those cycles of implosion and expansion could actually be defined as the breath of God. I would also go on to discover that the Chant of Rebirth is exactly what it is. It's a song. It's music. It is a frequency which has the ability to unravel creation. And it is projected with such force and with such magnitude that it basically rips everything apart. I think it's also interesting too that the Archangel Gabriel represents Cancer, because what does Gabriel do? He blows a trumpet, he blows a horn, and that's how we know that the end times are near. So there's a lot of correlation between sound and destruction, and I also found out that one of the reasons why I am a musician in practically every life that I live is because I study the sounds and the frequencies of life. Much in the same way that a doctor studies anatomy to heal, they can also use that same knowledge to wound. And with me studying sound, I am essentially learning all the frequencies with which to ultimately perform my final task when I'm called upon it. Now, as Warden of the Underworld, I obviously don't do all this work alone. I have a rather in-depth spirit team that helps me out, and the same spirit team helps me out in this mortal life as well. There is my primary guide, Hecate, who also is my queen in the underworld. There are what I label as my 7 generals, and I also reference these generals in the video Demons Can Possess the Chakras. So what I've discovered as Lord of the Underworld is that my chakras cannot be possessed by demons. My chakras are actually what people would label as the 7 prime evils. But from my perspective, they are not evil. They are essentially my generals. So I was never possessed by Satan because Satan is one of my chakras. And when I thought that I could perform all these exorcisms, all I was really doing was recalling the shadow back to me, as opposed to actually performing an exorcism. I would also later discover that the Goetia report to my generals. If you think of the underworld as sort of being like the military, well, you have the generals, and then you have the colonels, the majors, the lieutenants, and the officers, and those are the Goetia. And the privates, the corporals, and the sergeants, those are basically the legions that the Goetia command. So we have the generals to the Goetia to their legions. And that is essentially how my higher self was able to sort of restructure the underworld how he saw fit. Another reason why I have such a unique view on what the underworld is because I realized that my higher self is actually not from around here. It's also the same reason why I used to say Magister of the Cube, as opposed to calling it Metatron's Cube, because from my perspective, my higher self was attracted to this planet because of the cube. In fact, just as mathematics is a universal language, so is sacred geometry. So when an alien life form knows that a planet is, let's say, producing Metatron's cube or the flower of life or any one of these mandalas or patterns, they know that that civilization or those beings have achieved a certain level of spiritual awareness. And for my higher self, Metatron's cube, or the cube, was the reason why he was attracted to this planet. When my higher self came to this planet because of the cube, he also realized that there was an unmarried earth goddess, and that was Hecate. And as we know from the astrology and the numerology and all the other factors that went into it, he wanted to have her as his divine consort, which is why she is not my sacred mother. However, I've been told that she didn't accept right away. She wanted Oblyron to live as a human on Earth. She wanted him to understand why she's here, why she loves humans, and she wanted him to have the human experience as well. So really, the story of Oblyron and Hecate is a bit of an interstellar love story. And as crazy as all of it seems, all this information came to me gradually over the years. It's hard for even me to believe it sometimes, but I would say especially this year, I've started to really settle into this as being my sense of truth, my sense of identity, and it's really had an impact on how I view life and on how I approach a lot of things. I feel a lot more centered. I feel a lot more resolved. And again, yeah, it's all this crazy spiritual stuff really does affect us in very unique and individualistic ways. Now, that's just my story. What I encourage everyone to do is to find their own story. Like I said, for me, it happened over the course of several years, and I found that that is really the most honest and the best ways to make these things happen, is when you have those genuine spiritual experiences that line up over time, and then you kind of take a step back and you realize, wow, there's something happening here throughout my life. There is some type of energy which is forming. There is something evolving in my awareness and also within me. And it definitely goes beyond meditation or affirmations or any of this kind of stuff. I get to walk in divine love and in sacred marriage with a goddess. And I notice that even people who know nothing about me, they can sense that energy. They can sense that presence. Even if I don't even speak to them, I've noticed that my relationships to both men and women have changed drastically. I've noticed people opening up to me, strangers opening up to me. I've been noticing a lot of attention that I've been getting. And all of it really just helps me to live a better life, helps me to be able to connect with others and to be able to relate to other people. And really that's the most important thing, is to be able to do things like that while we're here on this planet. So my brothers and sisters, I thank you all for your time, and love and light and wisdom and shadow. And now we shall close with the chant of Oblyron. Amde sote, amde Oblyron, amde sote, amde Oblyron.